Hey, this is Cam with Blacktail Studio, and this week I am really excited because this video is the entire process of taking these 3 slabs and turning them into what might be my favorite table to date. You can see here I'm just confirming the layout that it already made with this little template, and then I'm going to start cutting here in a second, but before I did that I wanted to confirm my size. So I made it about an inch bigger on all sides so that way I can trim it down to the exact size that the client wants. In my past videos, one of the main questions I get is, what is a specific tool that I'm using? So I'm going to put a link to everything I can think of down in the description below, like these DeWalt track clamps. They're super handy and about half the price of the Festool ones. And that's also a Festool track, so I'll put a link to that too. The other big question I got was, how much does the slab cost? And that is a totally fair question, and sometimes the clients want me to keep that a secret. Other times they don't care. These slabs for these 3 tables ended up costing me a total of about $1,500. But the cool thing is there's going to be a lot of slab left over when I'm done, so I can actually make more tables from the remaining slabs. So kind of a neat little bonus to have enough slab left over to make tables after this. This here is a Festool track clamp. It's fine. It's not my favorite clamp, but it does serve its purpose for this. And here you can see I'm just finding any way I can to cut this last little bit off. The jigsaw worked a little faster than my track saw. And then I'm just cutting down to that line with my bandsaw. And if you haven't gathered yet, I'm basically just prepping these slabs to get them to the rough size so I can fit them in the mold, not have a ton of epoxy waste, and have everything relatively square, but they will not be perfect yet. Moving on to just the cleanup here, and any softwood, you want to take it out because I'll actually give you a little bit of a spoiler. Later in the video, I did not get all of this softwood out, and you get to see what happens if you leave kind of a soft rotted piece in after getting the finish, which caused kind of a disaster that I completely had to refinish the entire tabletop after being essentially done with it. So you can look forward to seeing that later in the video. But for now, this is how I'm getting rid of all this soft, loose wood. My favorite thing for this type of work is a nice dull chisel, but once I get all the big pieces off, I like to take it outside because it gets super messy. This is actually my least favorite job of any part of these epoxy tables, is strap these down, and I'm going to break out an angle grinder with a wire wheel, and it causes a big mess. Use a lot of face protection, gloves. It'll even throw these little wire needles that'll stick in your clothes and even stick in your skin. It is pretty necessary though, and it does do a good job of removing all the softwood and leaving all of the hardwood. And I also have my impact driver with a brass wheel in there for getting into a little bit tighter areas. Moving on to making the form, when I cut my sides, I like to cut them at least an inch, if not 2 to 3 inches taller than the highest point on the slab, so that way you don't have to worry about any type of epoxy spilling over. I think I cut these about 1.5 inches taller than the thickest slab I have. If you're curious, this material is called melamine, and it's available from Home Depot or Lowe's. It runs for about $30 for a 4x8 sheet, so you can get quite a bit out of one of those $30 sheets. And if you're careful with your mold release, you can actually reuse it on projects sometimes. The caulk I'm using is a 20-minute caulk that I get from Home Depot. It's a water-based caulk that takes about 20 minutes to set up. I do let these set overnight though. It's kind of really important. I tried using them faster than that, and I've gotten leaks before. So fast dry caulk, and the important thing about that is it comes apart a lot easier than like a silicone does. I've talked about this a little bit in some past videos. Not everybody seals the edges of their pieces when they're doing these builds, and that's okay. I've had a lot of luck when I do seal them. I do know some really good epoxy table builders that don't, so it's kind of up to you if you decide to. It will reduce the bubbles that you use. This is going to be a black table, so that doesn't particularly matter. Overall, I recommend it, but not everybody does it, so it's kind of a judgment call. Some of the guys that don't seal these edges say that they get a little bit better bond with the epoxy kind of penetrating the wood, and I could see that being true. If you do decide to seal it, make sure you use a fast drying epoxy. You don't want to use one of these ones that takes 3 days to set up just to seal the edges. You want something that's going to cure in 12 to 24 hours. When it comes to sealing the slabs with shellac, this is something I wouldn't skip no matter what. And the reason I do this is because if you're using any type of tinted epoxy, that tends to stain the wood really bad if you get any drips on the wood. So I just basically paint the entire thing with this de-wax shellac, and that'll prevent any of that color bleed from staining your wood. You could use a different type of, you could put like a polyurethane or something down, but that would take, whole day to dry, and this dries in about 5 minutes and it sands off super easy. So I really wouldn't recommend using anything else but a shellac. You can use the shellac with wax in it, but it'll tend to make the epoxy not stick to it. So that's why I always use the de-wax shellac. And even though I'm using the de-wax shellac, I still go back and you want to scuff up the edges of all the epoxy. You don't want anything shiny. And you don't need to go completely crazy, but basically the better you scuff it up, the better a bond you'll get with that epoxy from your deep pour that you're gonna kind of fill the entire thing up with. And this is just kind of an overall good rule for painting or anything is paint, epoxy paint, all likes to stick to rough objects. Okay, we're almost to the fun stuff. Now that I'm kind of getting this organized, I had a hard time remembering which way everything went, and I think I got it there. But yeah, just kind of organizing everything, make sure everything fit, double check my size. You see there, that was the piece that broke off when I was cutting it, and I actually like it a lot better the way it ended up. So one of the cool things about the epoxy tables is there's no really right or wrong way. As long as everything looks pretty natural, you don't want any straight edges, and everything seemed to kind of click together with this table. So I was pretty happy with how it worked. It is important to clamp down your work because it will float if you're filling it all the way up, and you'll actually see that I had a couple pieces start floating in the middle of the pour, so that was kind of frustrating. But this here is a little dam that I'm making, and it's the same quick drying caulk that I used before, and this is so I can fill it all the way to the top and it doesn't cover the entire slab in order to get that last little eighth of an inch if, you know, maybe one slab is just a hair taller than the other one or if it's not perfectly level. Okay, this is the fun time and also the kind of nerve-wracking time. And you can see there I'm using Epoxy, their 2-to-1 formula. I mentioned this before in my past videos. Some people were still a little confused. Only use the 2-to-1 formula. Do not use the 1-to-1. It doesn't work. Only use the 2-to-1 for these types of tables. With every project, there's things that you can be a little bit more lax on and things that you need to be a little more strict on. And the epoxy portion of this is one you definitely need to be very, very strict on. Make sure you get your ratios exactly right. Make sure that you mix it extremely well. When you're doing your color though, that's just a preference. So you can see what I do here is I drop in a bunch, mix it up, and I use a cup and I measured that cup the height of my table. And you'll see what I do is I look down and that'll get you a really good idea of the color of your epoxy when it's completely cured. Where if you look into a bucket, it's a lot darker than if you look into a cup there. So that's how I test my colors. But again, mix it really, really well. Get the sides, get the bottom. Can't emphasize enough, get your ratios right and get your mixing right because there really is no way around it if you don't get it thoroughly mixed and then do your pour. Now this epoxy is kind of specially formulated to really minimize the bubbles, which if you've ever worked with epoxy, bubbles are the biggest problem. It doesn't mean it's completely bubble proof, but it does mean that like the vast majority of them will pop themselves. You see just the act of pouring will actually induce quite a few bubbles. Again, 95% of those will pop themselves, but I really try not to splash it in or really give myself any more chance to induce more bubbles that I don't have to when I'm pouring this. And at this point, I've done about 30 of these tables and I still make mistakes. You can see here as I'm pouring this, even though the wood's clamped down, part of it starts to float and it kind of caused a few problems for me. It wasn't a complete disaster, but I ended up wasting a lot of epoxy because I thought I had to keep adding more and more when really it was just causing the wood to float. And so when I push it down, the epoxy completely submerged it. You can see here just in a second. I think I show you by pushing down on it how much it was floating. I do really like these kind of fat syringes for filling in the little holes and small cracks. They do a good job of that. And there you can see exactly how much it starts overflowing once I pushed it down. As I was editing this, I realized I didn't show the process of adding the mold release to the form. And that's going to be what makes it possible for this melamine to come off of the epoxy. Because if you don't add the mold release, this melamine will not come off. So I'll add a link to one of my other videos where I do show that process if you do want to see that, because it is definitely something you don't want to skip. I am pretty fortunate to live in a place that will rent me out time on their giant planer that also has 2 wide belt sanders. So I take it in there because for about 75 bucks, they will let me run it through a few times. And that saves me about a day of kind of router sledding or hand sanding to get it down to the perfectly flat, perfectly sanded level that they give it to me at. So pretty fortunate for that. Okay, now that I got it home, I can start all the fun stuff. And this is going to be where this slab really comes alive and we really get to make it look good, because in part 2, we're going to do the sanding, the finishing, kind of a medium screw up, how to fix that medium screw up, and attaching a super cool custom base I had made for this. But make sure you click over to watch part 2 right now. Thanks so much, and please subscribe for more.